The sun climbed steadily into the clear September sky as Flight 715 taxied across the Newark runway. The Boeing 757 gleamed in the morning light, its fuselage reflecting streaks of gold. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Miller adjusted his headset, scanning the instrument panel with the precision of a man who had done this thousands of times before. His co-pilot, First Officer James Whitaker, gave a quick nod as he finished his checks. "Everything looks good," Miller said, his voice calm but focused. Clear skies ahead. The aircraft's engines roared as it lifted from the ground, leaving behind the sprawling city skyline. Passengers settled into their seats, relieved to escape the morning rush. For many, this was routine. For a few, it was a special trip. For Elaine Rivers, seated quietly in row 14, it was simply another business journey. Elaine was not remarkable at first glance. Dressed in a navy blazer with her hair tied neatly at the back, she looked like any professional traveler. She carried a slim leather briefcase, a paperback novel, and a calmness that stood out only because the world around her was so hurried. While others shuffled luggage, complained about delays, or clutched paper cups of coffee, she sat still, her posture erect, her eyes scanning her surroundings with quiet attentiveness. The flight attendants began their routine. Oxygen masks and life vests were displayed with practiced gestures that most passengers barely noticed. Some chuckled nervously. Others ignored it entirely, already absorbed in magazines, laptops, or the small glow of personal screens. Children giggled at cartoons, businessmen flipped open spreadsheets, and couples leaned close to whisper plans. It was ordinary, perfectly ordinary. But only for a little while. Captain Miller enjoyed flights like this. He liked the calm skies, the hum of the engines, the sense of command. Yet as he glanced back through the small window in the cockpit door, he noticed the cabin was more restless than usual. A man in seat 7C fidgeted constantly, his eyes darting toward the aisle. Another, seated near the back, adjusted something beneath his jacket, movements stiff and unnatural. Miller frowned but said nothing. As a pilot, he had learned to dismiss nervous flyers and restless passengers. But something gnawed at him, something just outside the ordinary rhythm of the cabin. At 9:42 a.m., it began. A sudden, guttural shout ripped through the cabin, shattering the peaceful drone of the engines. Heads snapped up, eyes wide with confusion. Before anyone could react, 3 men leapt to their feet, knives glinting in the fluorescent cabin lights. Their voices were harsh, filled with rage and control. "Sit down. Do not move." One of them roared, brandishing his weapon above a row of passengers. Panic spread instantly. A child screamed, setting off a chain reaction of cries and gasps. A flight attendant stumbled backward, her tray scattering drinks and plastic cups across the aisle. The leader of the group, tall and broad-shouldered, with a scarf pulled tightly around his face, stormed toward the cockpit. He slammed a fist against the reinforced door, his voice echoing with fury. "Open, now!" Inside, Miller froze. His training screamed against giving in. The door stayed locked. His pulse raced as he heard the violence outside. "Emergency," he whispered to Whitaker, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the hijackers tightened their grip. One forced a man to the floor, pressing a blade to his throat. Another shoved a flight attendant into a seat, snarling at her to stay down. Fear swept like wildfire through the rows. Some passengers hid their faces in their hands, others cried uncontrollably, and some sat paralyzed, unable to move or even breathe. But one woman did not panic. Elaine Rivers remained upright in her seat, her expression calm, her breathing steady. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, and her eyes sharp, unwavering, locked onto the hijackers. She studied them with a strange stillness, the way a predator studies prey, unhurried and calculating. Miller, peering through the tiny cockpit window, caught sight of her. Amid the chaos, her composure struck him like a lightning bolt. Everyone else was cowering, breaking down, or screaming, but not her. She sat with a quietness that felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. What unsettled him most was her eyes. They weren't glazed with shock or panic. They were measuring, assessing, cataloging every detail. She followed the movements of the knives, the tones of the voices, the position of each attacker, as though mapping a battlefield. The lead terrorist continued pounding on the cockpit door, shouting threats in broken English. His accomplices kept the passengers subdued, waving their blades at anyone who dared to lift their head. But in the shadows of row 14, Elaine slowly slipped a small notebook from her purse. Shielded by the seat in front of her, she scribbled something with deliberate strokes. Then, without attracting attention, she tucked the note into her jacket pocket. Her calmness was infectious. The man seated beside her, trembling violently, glanced at her in disbelief. How can you be so calm?" he whispered. Elaine gave the faintest shake of her head, silencing him. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though urging him to stay quiet, to wait. Miller saw it again, the stillness, the purpose, and he couldn't look away. He leaned toward his co-pilot, whispering, "Do you see her? Row 14? Whitaker squinted through the tiny glass. "Yeah, what about her?" "She's not afraid," Miller murmured. "She's planning something." For a moment, he almost felt a strange reassurance. Yet he also felt an icy uncertainty. Who was she, and what could she possibly do against? 3 armed men in a sealed cabin at 30,000 feet? Outside the cockpit, the shouts grew louder. The lead hijacker began yanking terrified passengers from their seats, forcing them down the aisle as examples. Each scream ripped through the cabin like glass. Still, Elaine did not flinch. And then, at the peak of chaos, her eyes lifted. Through the narrow slit of the cockpit window, she met Captain Miller's gaze. The look lasted only seconds, but it burned into him. It was not a look of fear, nor of desperation. It was a look of command, steady, deliberate, filled with unspoken instruction. It was as though she were telling him, "Wait, watch, trust me." Miller's pulse thundered in his ears. For the first time since the nightmare began, a fragile thought formed in his mind. Maybe they weren't powerless. Maybe she was more than just a passenger. The cabin of Flight 715 had shifted from panic into a suffocating silence. The terrorists, knives gleaming under the cabin lights, kept the passengers subdued with barks and sudden violent gestures. Each time someone whimpered too loudly, one of the men turned with a snarl, blade raised, silencing the noise instantly. Captain Miller, locked behind the reinforced cockpit door, could hear everything through the intercom system. The shouting, the crying, the uneven gasps of fear. It was like listening to his own crew being dragged into a nightmare, powerless to intervene. His training demanded discipline, never open the cockpit, secure the aircraft at all costs. But his eyes were drawn again and again to row 14. Elaine Rivers hadn't moved much since the hijacking began. She sat upright, shoulders squared, her hands resting calmly on her thighs. She wasn't fidgeting, wasn't clutching the armrests, wasn't sobbing like so many others. Instead, she watched. The way her gaze shifted between each hijacker was unnerving, not frantic, not darting in panic, but methodical. Miller leaned forward in his seat, unable to look away. She wasn't just not afraid. She was calculating. "Bob, what are you staring at?" First Officer Whitaker asked, his voice taut with fear. "Row 14, the woman in the blazer," Miller whispered. Whitaker squinted through the tiny reinforced window in the cockpit door. "She looks calm, too calm. She's writing something." Miller muttered, Sure enough, Elaine had slipped her hand into her jacket pocket, retrieving a slim notepad no bigger than her palm. Shielded by her seat, she scribbled quickly with a pen, her eyes still flicking toward the hijackers. Then, with deliberate care, she tore a page free and folded it tightly. The co-pilot's brows knitted. What's she doing? Is she insane? If they see her, she knows the risk, Miller interrupted. That's not panic. That's preparation. On the other side of the cabin, the lead hijacker barked a string of commands in a thick, guttural accent. He dragged a terrified passenger to her feet and shoved her toward the front, blade grazing her cheek. You will sit quiet, or I cut her. He roared. The woman sobbed uncontrollably, nodding furiously. The rest of the passengers shrank further into their seats, their fear deepening with every second. But Elaine didn't shrink. When the hijacker turned away, she leaned toward the man beside her, a balding accountant who had been trembling nonstop. With a calm voice barely above a whisper, she pressed the folded note into his hand. Pass this down, quietly. Don't let them see, she murmured. The man looked at her as though she were insane. His lips trembled. What is it? Hope, Elaine whispered. He hesitated only a moment longer before slipping the paper to the woman beside him. Slowly, silently, the note moved from hand to hand, heartbeats quickening with every transfer. The terrorists remained distracted, one pacing near the rear, another arguing in low tones with his accomplice. Finally, the note reached a flight attendant crouched near the galley. Her hands shook violently as she unfolded it. Her eyes scanned the words, widening. She swallowed hard, then slid it onto the floor and nudged it forward with her shoe. Inch by inch, it scraped across the aisle until it reached the cockpit door. Inside, Miller noticed something on the floor beneath the slit. His pulse hammered. As he reached down and snatched the folded paper, Whitaker leaned in, his breath caught in his throat. Miller opened it. The handwriting was sharp, confident, hurried, but clear. 4 words were scrawled across the page. I have training. Wait. For a moment, the cockpit fell into silence. The engines droned steadily. The intercom buzzed faintly with muffled voices. But Miller's world had narrowed to those words. Whitaker blinked in disbelief. What does that mean? Training? What kind of training? Miller stared at the note, his heartbeat thunderous. She's not a normal passenger. She knows what she's doing. Whitaker shook his head, panic rising in his voice. We can't rely on some stranger scribbling notes. This could be a trick. Could be one of them. No, Miller said firmly, his eyes cutting back to row 14. Through the tiny window, he could see her posture upright, steady, eyes unflinching. Look at her. That's not fear. That's a soldier or an agent. Someone who's been in this situation before. Whitaker hesitated, torn between skepticism and the undeniable aura Elaine exuded even from a distance. Back in the cabin, the terrorists continued their menacing patrol. The passengers were cowed into silence, yet something invisible had shifted. Where there had been only despair, now a thin thread of something new crept in. Anticipation. A woman had sent a message. She claimed she had training. For those who had seen the note pass along, their fear now mingled with a flicker of fragile hope. Elaine knew the hijackers had noticed her stillness. One of them, wiry and jittery, narrowed his eyes at her. He strode forward and stopped at her row. His knife gleamed inches from her face. You, he growled. Why you not cry? Why you not shake like the others? The passengers around her held their breath. Elaine's heart pounded in her chest, but her face revealed nothing. She looked directly into his eyes, her voice steady. I am tired, she said simply. Crying won't help. For a moment, the hijacker stared at her, trying to read her expression. Then he snorted and shoved her passport off the tray table. Glancing briefly at the cover, before tossing it aside in disinterest. He moved on, pacing back toward the rear. Elaine's eyes tracked him until his back was turned. Then, with a small inhale, she resumed watching, measuring, waiting. Inside the cockpit, Miller's hands gripped the yoke tightly, though autopilot held the plane steady. He kept glancing at her, drawn to her presence like a compass. "She's signaling us," he murmured. Whitaker rubbed his temples. "You're reading too much into this. She's just unnervingly calm. That doesn't mean she can stop 3 armed men." But Miller wasn't convinced. He remembered the brief look she had given him earlier, the one that burned like a command. It wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. She had sent him a message. Through her eyes, just as surely as she had with that note. And deep down, though fear gnawed at him, Miller believed her. Somehow, in that suffocating cabin, amid the chaos of knives and threats, a single woman's calm had shifted the entire balance of power. She wasn't just surviving. She was preparing. The cabin felt like a sealed tomb, heavy with fear. The recycled air seemed thinner now, choked with a metallic tang of panic. Every whimper, every muffled sob sounded deafening in the tense silence. The terrorists moved like wolves through the aisles, snapping at their prey to keep them subdued. Elaine Rivers sat unmoving in her seat, her navy blazer neat despite the chaos swirling around her. The notepad was gone now, the message delivered, her actions invisible to the hijackers who prowled nearby. Yet she knew they had noticed her. Composure. Fearful eyes kept darting toward her, passengers bewildered by her strange serenity. And then it happened. The wiry hijacker, the one with sunken cheeks and eyes, like shards of glass stopped mid-aisle. His gaze narrowed as he fixed on Elaine. Something about her unsettled him, some contradiction he couldn't reconcile. He stomped forward, his boots striking the floor with heavy finality. The blade in his hand caught the overhead light as he raised it menacingly toward her. "You," he spat, his accent thick, his words sharp as knives. "Why you sit so calm?" Passengers froze, holding their breath. The man beside Elaine, trembling, clutched the seat as though expecting her to be dragged away. The hijacker leaned closer, his face twisted with suspicion. Elaine's pulse hammered in her chest, but her exterior didn't betray it. She locked her gaze onto his with unnerving steadiness. "Because panicking won't change anything," she said, her voice quiet but unshaken. The words hung in the air like a blade. For a moment, the hijacker seemed almost thrown off balance by her lack of fear. Rage flickered in his eyes as he slammed her passport from the seat-back pocket, flipping it open. He scanned it with a sneer, then tossed it aside onto the floor. "You think you are strong," he hissed, "but you will break." Elaine didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She simply blinked once, slowly, before turning her eyes back toward the front of the plane as though dismissing him. The hijacker snarled and stormed off, muttering curses under his breath. A collective breath exhaled from the passengers nearby, though none dared speak. Elaine's display had been subtle, but it sent ripples through the cabin. She hadn't fought back, hadn't screamed or defied him in a way that would provoke violence. She had simply stood her ground with silence and composure. In a space ruled by fear, her calmness was a rebellion itself. From the cockpit, Captain Miller had seen it all. His face was pale, his hands tight on the controls, though the autopilot was engaged. "She didn't even blink," Whitaker muttered, his voice low and shaken. Miller leaned closer to the window, staring at Elaine. "She's not like the others," he whispered. "She's trained. You can see it in her eyes." "That's discipline." Whitaker shook his head. "Discipline doesn't stop knives. We're trapped in here, Bob. You know the protocol. We keep the cockpit sealed. We don't get involved." Miller swallowed hard, his mind torn. He knew the rules, knew the manuals, knew the strict procedures drilled into him since the day he first touched a yoke. But the manuals hadn't accounted for her. Back in the cabin, Elaine's mind worked furiously. Every detail mattered. She had already noted the weapons. 2 knives, a sharpened piece of metal fashioned like a spike. No firearms. That was their weakness. She catalogued their movements. The tall leader patrolled the front, barking orders, slamming the cockpit door with his fist every few minutes. The wiry man stalked the middle, eager and reckless. The third hovered near the rear, more cautious, glancing often toward his comrades for direction. Elaine memorized their patterns like a dancer learning choreography. Timing, spacing, rhythm, every step they took added to her mental map. She knew her calmness was drawing attention, and she used it deliberately. Fear was loud. Composure was invisible armor. The man beside her finally dared to whisper, "Who are you?" His lips quivered, his hands shaking violently. Elaine's eyes flicked to him for the briefest moment. "Someone who knows what they're doing," she replied softly. "Stay quiet. Stay ready." The words both reassured and terrified him. Ready for what? He wondered. A sudden shriek cut through the cabin as the leader yanked a young man from his seat, pressing a blade to his throat. The hijacker's voice thundered. "If anyone moves, he dies." His eyes blazed as he glanced toward the cockpit. "Open the door, or I kill him now." Miller's heart lurched at the sound of the threat. His training clashed with his humanity, the weight of dozens of lives pressing on his shoulders. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself not to respond. Through the chaos, Elaine's mind sharpened. This was escalation. Terrorists grew louder when they felt control slipping. She could feel their nerves fraying. That was leverage. Her eyes darted to the aisle. When the leader shifted his weight, she noticed his grip wasn't steady. His hand trembled slightly, whether from adrenaline or doubt. The wiry man snapped at him in their native tongue, their coordination slipping for just a second. It was enough. Elaine shifted in her seat, leaning ever so slightly forward, her posture no longer passive. Passengers around her noticed. Their eyes flicked to her, silently asking, "What now?" She didn't move further, but her body spoke. She was waiting for the right moment, and when it came, she would act. From the cockpit, Miller whispered, "She's planning something. I know it." Whitaker groaned, dragging a hand across his face. "And what if she fails? What if they kill her? What if they kill all of us because she provokes them?" Miller's gaze didn't waver. "She's not provoking them. She's reading them. She's biding her time." His chest tightened as he remembered the note in his pocket. "I have training. Wait for my signal." The thought gave him both hope and dread. If she truly had training, military, intelligence, counterterrorism, then perhaps she was their only chance. But if she was wrong, if she miscalculated even once, the cost would be unthinkable. Back in row 14, Elaine closed her eyes for a brief second, inhaling deeply. She centered herself, pushing down the fear clawing at the edges of her mind. She couldn't afford to falter. Not now. When her eyes opened again, they locked once more on the cockpit window. For a heartbeat, she and Miller stared at each other through the reinforced barrier. The connection was silent but powerful. His expression was taut, lined with dread. Hers was steady, filled with quiet determination. The message was clear. Trust. Me. The cockpit's hum swallowed Miller's uneven breath. He sat back, torn between protocol and instinct. Whitaker muttered something about procedure, but Miller barely heard him. All he could see was her face, her unshakable eyes burning through the glass. And in that moment, He made a choice, one he could never explain to the manual writers. One that went against every protocol drilled into his bones. He would wait. He would trust her. Because somehow, against all reason, he believed she could do what no one else dared. Elaine wasn't just another passenger. She was the storm waiting to break. The minutes dragged like hours. Flight 715 cruised at 30,000 feet, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended, locked in a purgatory of fear. Every sound was magnified, the hiss of the air vents, the creak of a seat spring, the faint sob of a child, muffled against her mother's chest. The terrorists prowled the aisles, their knives catching glints of light, their eyes burning with restless fury. Elaine Rivers sat perfectly still in row 14, but her mind moved like wildfire. She replayed every motion, every detail. Way the leader favored his right side, as though concealing an injury. The wiry one's twitchy impatience. The third's constant glances backward, as if seeking reassurance. Weaknesses existed. She just needed time and allies. Then came the announcement that shattered any illusions of survival. The tall leader stomped toward the center of the cabin, blade raised high. His accent was thick, but the threat was unmistakable. "This plane will not land San Francisco," he roared. "This plane will strike. You sit quiet, or you die screaming." Gasps rippled through the passengers like shockwaves. A woman collapsed into tears, clutching the hand of the stranger beside her. A man buried his face in his palms. The words drained hope from the air, leaving only dread. But Elaine's jaw tightened. Strike. That meant a target, not negotiation. These men weren't here for ransom or asylum. They were here for destruction. Every person on board was already marked for death. The only question left was how much damage would follow. And that knowledge was freeing. If death was certain, then there was nothing left to lose. Only one option remained: fight. She leaned slightly toward the balding man beside her, the one who had helped pass her first note. His hands still trembled, but his eyes clung to her, desperate for direction. "You'll help me," she whispered. He blinked in shock. "Help? I can't." You can," she said firmly. Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. "Do what I ask, no more. Trust me." Her certainty was a lifeline, and, against all logic, he nodded. She pulled another scrap of paper from her notepad, shielding it carefully behind the seat in front of her. Her handwriting was quick, concise, trained for clarity under pressure. Organizing resistance. Several will. Fight. Wait for signal. Trust me. She folded it into a tight square and pressed it into his trembling palm. "Same as before," she murmured, quiet, careful. The man swallowed hard and slipped the note across the aisle when the wiry terrorist's back was turned. The folded message crept through the cabin again, seat by seat, inch by inch, like a whisper moving through the crowd. Each transfer was a gamble, one wrong move, one sudden glance, and everything would collapse. Finally, it reached a flight attendant crouched near the galley. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, but her eyes burned with something sharper, now resolve. She bent low, pushing the note along the carpet until it reached the reinforced cockpit door. Inside, Captain Miller noticed the square of paper sliding into view. His hands shook as he picked it up. Whitaker hovered anxiously at his shoulder. Miller unfolded the note and read the words. His chest tightened. Organizing resistance. Several will fight. Wait for signal. He looked up immediately, eyes locking through the cockpit window to row 14. There she was, Elaine, sitting, with the same unnerving calm. But now her gaze carried something new. Command. "She's building something," Miller whispered. Whitaker's face paled. "This is madness. Civilians against armed men? They'll slaughter everyone." He'll slaughter everyone anyway, Miller said. Sharply. She knows it. That's why she's doing this. Whitaker shook his head, his voice cracking. Bob, you can't actually think. I think, Miller interrupted, that she may be the only chance we've got. Back in the cabin, Elaine's eyes scanned the passengers carefully. Not everyone could be counted on. Some were too paralyzed, some too frail, some clinging to children. But here and there, sparks of courage flickered in faces. The man in 16A, broad-shouldered and quietly furious. The young woman in 12C, fists clenched, jaw tight. The flight attendant who had passed her note, eyes steady despite tears. Elaine gave them subtle signals, a glance, a nod, the faintest flick of her fingers. The language of preparation passed silently between them, invisible to the hijackers. The wiry man stalked past again, muttering under his breath. Elaine seized the moment. She straightened slightly, catching his eye deliberately. Water, she said calmly. The request startled him. What? Water, she repeated, her tone firm but even. You want us quiet. You keep us alive. Passengers need water. The terrorist glared at her, knife twitching in his grip. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out. But then, with a dismissive growl, he snapped toward the rear. Bring her water. Elaine accepted the plastic cup with steady hands, sipping once, then setting it aside. The act had been nothing, and yet everything. For 30 precious seconds, the terrorist's attention had been pulled elsewhere. Passengers shifted subtly, fingers tightening around improvised weapons, a broken bottle, a belt buckle, the sharp edge of a laptop. The quiet rebellion was taking shape. Miller watched from the cockpit, awe tightening his chest. She wasn't just calm, she was orchestrating. Her small gestures, her measured tone, her refusal to cower. It was rippling through the cabin, transforming terror into something else. Hope. She's leading them, Miller murmured. Whitaker's jaw clenched. And if it fails? If they don't succeed, we'll be flying a coffin straight into whatever target these lunatics choose. Miller folded the note carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket. His decision was made. Then we wait for her signal. The plane hummed steadily through the sky, an ordinary machine carrying an extraordinary war. Passengers sat rigid, in their seats, hearts thundering, waiting for the unknown moment when silence would shatter into chaos. And in the center of it all sat Elaine Rivers, calm, calculating, her mind racing with strategies she had long hoped she'd never need. Again, she knew the risks. She knew the blood that would spill. But she also knew this. The difference between death as victims and death as fighters was choice. And she had already chosen. When her eyes lifted to the cockpit window again, Captain Miller was there, watching. Their gazes locked, two strangers bound by an unspoken pact. Her look said everything. It's coming. The cabin air had changed. It was still heavy with fear, but beneath it, something new flickered, an undercurrent of defiance. Elaine Rivers felt it in the glances passed between strangers, in the way fingers curled around improvised weapons, in the sudden straightening of spines. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it was being reshaped, forged into a harder alloy. Elaine had seen this before, in war zones, in covert operations, in places where survival demanded transformation. People who had never fought could become fighters. When cornered, if only someone showed them how. On Flight 715, that task had fallen to her. She leaned slightly toward the flight attendant, crouched 2 rows ahead. Her whisper was barely audible above the hum of the engines. How many crew are still mobile? The attendant's eyes darted nervously before she whispered back. 4, maybe 5. The rest hurt or restrained. Elaine gave a firm nod. Tell them to be ready. No sudden moves until I signal. The attendant hesitated, then slipped away, under the guise of checking on passengers. Across the aisle, the broad-shouldered man in 16 amperes clenched and unclenched his fists, glaring at the terrorists. Elaine caught his eye, then subtly tapped her wrist with 2 fingers. "Wait." He frowned but gave a slow nod. Piece by piece, she built her network. A young woman tore a strip from her scarf, twisting it tightly around her fists as makeshift padding. A teenage boy slid his baseball cap backward, eyes sharp with determination. A businessman quietly removed his belt, looping it through his hands like a whip. Each movement was small, but together they formed a quiet storm building beneath the surface. The terrorists remained tense, their nerves stretched thin by the silence. The wiry one prowled constantly, snapping at passengers to keep their heads down. The youngest kept shifting his grip on the knife, his inexperience showing. Only the leader remained composed, standing near the cockpit, eyes locked on the door as if daring the pilots to resist. Elaine studied them relentlessly. Every stride, every turn of the head, every moment of distraction was catalogued. Timing would be everything. Strike too soon, and chaos would break apart the fragile unity she'd built. Wait too long, and the terrorists would realize their passengers were no longer broken. She reached for her notepad again, scribbling a new message. "We are ready. At my signal, strike as one. Focus on blades first. Disarm, then restrain." This time she didn't pass the note. Instead, she tore it into tiny fragments, tucking pieces into her palm. When she moved through the cabin under the pretense of stretching, she pressed the fragments discreetly into hands, each recipient piecing the words together silently. The signal she had chosen was simple. She would stand. Nothing more, nothing less. When Elaine Rivers rose from her seat, every willing passenger would know the time had come. The weight of responsibility pressed heavy on her chest. She glanced at the faces around her, frightened, desperate, but resolute. If she failed, it wouldn't just be her blood spilled. It would be theirs. Yet she knew the greater truth. If they didn't fight, they would all perish anyway, and countless others on the ground would follow. A sudden shout snapped her thoughts. The wiry terrorist yanked a man from his seat, slamming him into the aisle. "Quiet!" he roared, pressing the knife to the man's throat. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The victim's wife screamed, clawing at her seatbelt. Elaine's muscles tensed. Her hand twitched toward the armrest, ready to rise, ready to launch the signal. But she forced herself still. Not yet. One premature move would ruin everything. Instead, she caught the terrorist's eye. Her expression was cold, steady, unflinching. It unsettled him. His grip faltered just slightly, confusion flashing across his face. Why wasn't she afraid? Why didn't she break like the others? He shoved the man back into his seat and snarled something in his native tone before storming down the aisle. The moment passed, but it left behind a charged silence. Elaine exhaled slowly. The passengers who had seen her restraint now understood something vital. She wasn't reckless. She was calculating. That trust would hold them together when the storm broke. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller and Whitaker could feel the atmosphere shifting. Through the small window, Miller saw the movements, the nods, the subtle exchanges. He recognized it instantly. A plan was taking root. "She's training them," Miller whispered, "turning them into a unit." Whitaker shook his head in disbelief. "They're passengers, Bob. Office workers, kids, retirees. Doesn't matter," Miller cut him off. "With her, they believe they can fight. That's half the battle." Whitaker's voice was grim. "And the other half?" Miller's eyes hardened. "Blood." Back in the cabin, Elaine rested her hands on her knees, closing her eyes briefly. She replayed the timing in her head. The wiry one always circled every 2 minutes. The young one lingered at the back for nearly 30 seconds before returning. The leader remained fixated on the cockpit. Their pattern was predictable. Predictability was exploitable. Her heart pounded, but her breathing remained slow, measured. She had taught countless others this technique controls the body, and the mind will follow. Fear was inevitable, but fear could be mastered. When she opened her eyes, she saw the boy across the aisle watching her. No older than 16, his lips trembled, his eyes wide. He clutched a sharpened pen like a dagger, but his hands shook violently. Elaine leaned slightly toward him, her voice soft but commanding. Breathe. In through the nose, out through the mouth. You are not a victim. Do you understand? He nodded weakly. Say it, she insisted. I'm not a victim. Again, I'm not a victim. His voice steadied, just slightly. Elaine gave him a small nod. Good. Remember that. The boy's shoulders squared for the first time since the hijacking began. His pen didn't look so fragile anymore. The hours stretched on. The terrorists grew restless, barking orders, pacing harder, their discipline fraying. Passengers shifted with anticipation, their eyes drawn constantly to Elaine. She could feel their silent question pressing against her. When? Her fingers drummed softly on her thigh. She knew the answer was close. But she also knew one truth, above all else. There would be no second chance. When she stood, when she gave. The signal, everything would erupt. There would be screaming, pain, blood. Victory was not guaranteed. But surrender was not an option. Elaine lifted her gaze to the cockpit window. Captain Miller was there, watching. For the briefest moment, she allowed him to see the fire in her eyes. Not despair, not fear, but determination sharper than any blade. Miller's breath caught. He knew it was coming. Soon, the silence would end. And when it did, the world would remember what happened on Flight 715. The plane hummed steadily through the high skies, but inside the cabin, the silence was unbearable. It was the silence before a storm, thick with unspoken tension. Every breath, every shifting body, every faint creak of a seat carried the weight of expectation. Passengers sat rigid, eyes flicking constantly toward Elaine Rivers, the woman who had somehow become their anchor. Elaine kept her gaze on the wiry terrorist as he stalked past again, knife glinting beneath the cabin lights. His pacing was predictable, almost metronomic. She timed his strides with her breaths. 2 minutes, always 2 minutes before he circled back. The young one at the rear still lingered too long by the galley, distracted. The leader near the cockpit remained fixated on the locked door, shouting insults toward the unseen pilots. Patterns, predictability, weaknesses. She had waited long enough. Elaine rose from her seat. The motion was small, simple, but to those watching, it was thunder, the signal. Gasps flickered through the cabin, quickly swallowed into determination. The broad-shouldered man in 16A tightened his grip on a broken bottle. The teenager with the sharpened pen clenched his jaw. The flight attendant crouched low, hands wrapped around a heavy fire extinguisher. The wiry terrorist spun instantly, shock flashing in his eyes. "Sit down," he barked, raising his knife. Elaine did not move. Instead, she took one deliberate step into the aisle. Her voice was steady, cold, carrying across the cabin with cutting clarity. Now, chaos erupted. Passengers surged like a breaking wave. The broad-shouldered man lunged first, slamming his bottle against the wiry terrorist's arm. The knife clattered to the floor as two more pounced, dragging him down in a flurry of fists and rage. Screams filled the cabin, but this time they were not screams of despair. They were screams of defiance. The young hijacker at the rear spun too late. The teenage boy, trembling but fierce, drove his pen deep into the attacker's forearm. The man howled, dropping his blade. A mother swung her laptop bag into his face, staggering him backward into the galley. Passengers swarmed, overpowering him with sheer desperation. But the leader was fast. He wheeled from the cockpit door, knife flashing as he barreled down the aisle. His blade slashed across the arm of a man who tried to block him, drawing a spray of blood. Terror threatened to choke the resistance, but then Elaine stepped forward, directly into his path. Their eyes locked. His burned with fury, hers with steel. He lunged. Elaine sidestepped, grabbing his wrist with practiced precision. Her other hand drove upward, striking the base of his chin. The knife wavered, but his strength was immense. He roared, shoving her back against a seat. Passengers screamed as the blade slashed dangerously close to her chest. But Elaine's grip was unyielding. She twisted sharply, forcing his wrist downward until the knife point turned toward his own thigh. With a guttural cry, she rammed his hand against the seat frame. The blade pierced flesh, not hers. The leader howled, collapsing to his knees. The cabin was a storm of violence. Fists pummeled, bodies crashed into seats, blood stained the aisle. Yet the tide was shifting. The terrorists, once feared, were now drowning beneath the sheer force of dozens of desperate people who had decided they would not die quietly. Elaine yanked the knife free from the leader's thigh, tossing it behind her to a passenger who kicked it far out of reach. She drove her knee into his chest, pinning him down. Her voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the chaos. Restrain them. Use belts, scarves, anything you have tied them down. Her authority galvanized them. Belts came off in a frenzy. Scarves tightened around wrists. Seatbelts twisted into makeshift restraints. The wiry terrorist thrashed, his face bloodied, but 3 men held him fast, binding his arms and legs. The young one screamed curses, but a group of passengers forced him into a seat, securing him with every strap they could find. The leader still fought, his strength monstrous even through the pain. He grabbed Elaine's collar, dragging her down, spitting rage into her face. You will all die. Elaine's fist cracked against his jaw. Not today. With the help of 2 others, she forced him into a seat, binding him so tightly he could barely breathe. His eyes, wild with hatred, darted between the passengers who now stood over him, not as victims, but as victors. For a moment, the cabin was frozen in disbelief. Heavy breathing filled the silence, bodies trembling with adrenaline. The passengers looked around at one another, their eyes wide, their hands bloodied. They had done it. Against all odds, they had risen. Elaine stood in the center, chest heaving, hair loose from its tie, her blazer torn. She scanned the cabin, ensuring each terrorist was restrained, each weapon secured. Only then did she allow herself the faintest exhale of relief. Inside the cockpit, Captain Miller and Whitaker had listened to the chaos with pounding hearts. The screams, the thuds, the cries. It had been agony to stay behind the locked door. But when silence finally fell, Miller dared to look through the window. What he saw stole his breath. The terrorists bound. The passengers standing, bruised but alive. And in the middle, Elaine Rivers, her presence radiating command. She did it, Miller whispered. Whitaker shook his head in disbelief. Ordinary people don't do that. Miller's eyes stayed fixed on her. She's not ordinary. The cockpit door buzzed as Elaine knocked firmly, her voice steady despite the blood smeared on her cheek. It's clear. Open up. Miller hesitated only a moment before unlocking the door. Elaine stepped inside, closing it swiftly behind her. For the first time, they stood face to face. Up close, Miller saw the intensity in her eyes, the kind he had only ever seen in combat veterans. She was calm, but beneath that calmness lay something forged in fire. You saved them, he said quietly. Elaine shook her head. We saved each other. She glanced at the controls, then back at him. Now tell me, what's our situation? Miller swallowed. We've still got altitude, still got fuel. But if they had plans for this aircraft, they weren't small. We need to decide where we're taking her, and how fast. Elaine nodded. Then we don't waste time. The fight's not over yet. Behind them, in the cabin, passengers finally began to cry, not from fear, but from release. Parents held children tighter, strangers embraced, bloodied hands squeezed together. They were alive. They were free. At least for now. Elaine's eyes hardened as she looked out the cockpit window into the endless blue sky. She knew this was only the beginning. The plane had been saved, but their survival was still uncertain, and the world below. It was waiting to learn what had happened in these skies. The cabin of Flight 715 was unrecognizable. The neat rows of passengers, once orderly and subdued, are now disheveled, blood-stained, and trembling. Overturned drink carts blocked the aisles, broken trays littered the floor, and the air was thick, with the metallic tongue of blood and the acrid sting of adrenaline. The restrained terrorists writhed and cursed in their seats, their fury muted by belts, scarves, and improvised knots. But amid the chaos, there was life. People clung to each other, sobbing not from fear this time, but from the miracle of still being alive. Children were gathered into the arms of strangers who had shielded them during the fight. Strangers embraced like lifelong friends, bonded by survival. Elaine Rivers stood in the center of it all, her hands bloodied, her blazer torn, her hair clinging damply to her temples. She scanned the cabin methodically, her calm presence the only anchor in a storm of emotions. Check the injured, she ordered, her voice firm but steady. If anyone can move, help those who can't. Tear clothing for bandages. Use belts as tourniquets if needed. Passengers obeyed instinctively. The businessman who had wielded his belt now wrapped it tightly around the arm of a bleeding man. The young woman with the scarf pressed fabric against a deep cut on a flight attendant's forehead. The teenage boy, his hands still shaking, sat beside an elderly woman, whispering, "You're okay. We're okay," as much to himself as to her. Elaine crouched beside the broad-shouldered man from 16A. His bottle lay shattered, his knuckles swollen and raw. He winced as she inspected a gash across his forearm. "You saved lives," she told him quietly, binding his wound with a strip of fabric. He gave a shaky laugh. "I sell insurance. I've never even been in a fight." "You fought today," Elaine said. "That's what matters." At the rear, two passengers argued over whether the restrained young hijacker was still armed. Elaine strode over, her presence silencing them. She checked the bindings herself, pulling them tight until the man cried out in pain. She looked him dead in the eyes. "You will sit still," she said in a voice that brooked no defiance. "You've lost. Accept it." The young man spat at her feet. Elaine didn't flinch. She turned away, her focus on the living, not the defeated. In the cockpit, Captain Miller and Whitaker worked frantically. Miller's hands gripped the controls, his jaw tight. Whitaker scrolled through radio frequencies, his voice hoarse from repeated calls. "This is Flight 715. We've been hijacked. We've regained control. We require immediate landing clearance. Do you copy?" "Over." Static. He tried again. "This is Flight 715 emergency. Emergency. Respond." Finally, a crackle of response burst through. "Flight 715. This is air traffic control. Confirm status. Repeat. Confirm status." Miller leaned toward the mic. "This is Captain Robert Miller, Flight 715. 3 armed hijackers have been subdued. Passengers injured, multiple casualties. We need nearest available airport for emergency landing. Fuel status sufficient. There was a pause. Then the controller's voice returned, tense but controlled. Copy. 715. Divert to Denver International. Runway will be cleared. Emergency services en route. Maintain current altitude and heading until further instructions. Miller exhaled, relief mixing with dread. Roger, diverting to Denver. He turned to Whitaker. We've got one shot to get this bird down in one piece. Whitaker nodded grimly. If we don't, all of this will have been for nothing. Elaine entered the cockpit quietly, closing the door behind her. Miller glanced at her in the reflection of his instruments. Denver, he said simply. Elaine nodded. Good. How long? 40 minutes, give or take, Miller replied. Her eyes narrowed. 40 minutes is a long time for frightened people with adrenaline pumping. And terrorists still alive on board. Miller grimaced. What do you suggest? Elaine stepped closer, lowering her voice. Keep everyone busy. Injured need tending. Keep the rest occupied with helping. Idle hands feed panic. Miller studied her. You've done this before? Elaine didn't answer. Instead, she glanced at the restrained hijackers through the window, then back at him. They'll try something. Desperation makes people reckless. Don't underestimate them. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. The initial euphoria of victory had given way to exhaustion and shock. Some passengers sat staring blankly ahead, their minds unable to process what had happened. Others rocked silently, whispering prayers. The wounded moaned quietly as makeshift medics worked on them. Elaine moved from row to row, offering words that were short but grounding. You're safe now. We're almost there. You did well. Each phrase was a lifeline. She paused beside the teenage boy who had stabbed the young hijacker. He sat with his pen still clutched tightly, his knuckles white. His eyes were distant, haunted. You can let go now, Elaine said softly, placing a hand over his. His fingers trembled as the pen slipped from his grasp. Tears spilled down. His cheeks. I didn't want to. I didn't. I know, Elaine said. You did what you had to. And because of you, people are alive. Don't ever forget that. He sobbed quietly, and she stayed beside him until his breathing steadied. Time crawled. Every minute toward Denver felt like an hour. The restrained terrorists muttered curses, their eyes filled with venom. Elaine made sure they were never left unwatched, rotating volunteers to stand guard. She knew the danger wasn't gone. It had only changed shape. At 30 minutes out, turbulence rocked the plane. Passengers gasped, gripping armrests. Elaine steadied herself against a seat, her voice rising above the panic. Hold on, it's nothing. Just air currents. Her certainty calmed them. Fear subsided as quickly as it had flared. In the cockpit, Miller's hands were steady on the controls, but his mind was racing. He glanced at Elaine's reflection again. I don't know who you are, he said softly, but without you, we'd all be dead. Elaine's gaze stayed on the horizon. We're not safe yet. Save the gratitude for the ground. The descent began. The nose tilted downward, the engines roared, and the world below grew sharper with every passing second. Passengers braced, gripping hands, whispering prayers. The restrained hijackers thrashed one last time, but belts and scarves held firm. Elaine stood tall in the aisle, steady as a pillar, her eyes locked forward. 40 minutes had never felt so long. And yet, Denver was drawing closer. The storm inside Flight 715 was quieting, but the hardest part, the landing, was still ahead. Flight 715 shuddered as it pierced through the turbulent air above Denver. The engines hummed, the control surfaces responded with precision, and yet inside the cabin, the tension was palpable. Every passenger braced themselves, gripping hands, seat edges, anything they could hold on to. The adrenaline that had carried them through the fight began to ebb, leaving raw exhaustion, aching limbs, and the sharp sting of reality. Delane Rivers moved slowly through the aisle, scanning the cabin one last time. The wounded had been tended as best as could be managed mid-flight. Improvised bandages held, belts and scarves secured the restrained terrorists. She made mental notes. Who needed immediate medical attention, who might need counseling, who required reassurance to get off the plane without hysteria. The teenage boy who had stabbed the young hijacker sat quietly, staring at the floor. Elaine crouched beside him, her hand brushing his shoulder. "You did everything you could," she said softly. "You saved lives today." He nodded, voice trembling. I just wanted to survive." "You did more than survive," she replied. "You made sure others did too. That's something you'll carry forever." The broad-shouldered man, who had swung the bottle against the wiry terrorist, winced as Elaine checked his arm. "Never thought I'd be in a fight like this," he muttered. Elaine gave a faint smile. "None of us did. But you rose to it." At the front, the restrained leader glared, his face purple with rage. Elaine met his eyes briefly. "You had a choice," she said. "You chose this. Remember that when you see justice." The plane began its final descent. The runway stretched. Before them like a silver ribbon, emergency lights glinting in the growing dusk. Captain Miller's hands were steady on the yoke, but his eyes betrayed tension. He had flown thousands of hours, handled emergencies that rattled entire crews, but nothing like this. Nothing with stakes so personal. "Brace yourselves," he called into the intercom. "We're making our landing. Remain seated and follow instructions. Emergency crews are ready on the ground." Elaine moved to the center aisle, giving one final sweep. Every passenger's eyes were on her, seeking reassurance. She nodded, firm but calm. "This is almost over," she said. "Hold on. We're going to be okay." The turbulence grew, gusts battering the fuselage. Oxygen masks remained unused. Thankfully, the struggle had consumed all their focus. The plane dipped sharply as it aligned with the runway. Heartbeats thundered in every chest. Miller's voice broke the quiet hum of the engines. Engaging final approach. Gear down. Steady. Steady. The passengers' stomachs lifted. With every drop, the bound hijackers hissed, snarled, and kicked against their restraints. But Elaine stayed near, keeping watch, ensuring no one attempted a last-minute attack. A sudden jolt shook the cabin. The plane's wheels hit the tarmac with a deafening thud, tires screaming against asphalt. The impact threw some passengers forward, but belts and arms held firm. Flames from the landing lights reflected across windows as Miller expertly guided the plane down the runway, brakes screeching, engines roaring to counter speed. The passengers screamed, this time not from fear, but from relief. Elaine allowed herself a brief exhale, but she didn't sit. She moved quickly, checking the restrained terrorists once more. The wiry man, pinned to a seat, glared at her, teeth bared, eyes wild. The leader, breathing heavily, spat at the floor. Elaine met his gaze calmly. "It's done," she said. On the runway, emergency vehicles flanked the plane, their lights painting the fuselage in urgent red and blue. Paramedics and law enforcement. Personnel stormed forward, rushing to secure the scene. Elaine guided passengers, helping the injured and ensuring no one left the plane in panic. Miller and Whitaker stepped out of the cockpit, relief etched into every line of their faces. Elaine met them briefly. "You did it," Miller said quietly, awe in his voice. "We did it," she corrected. "Together." The world below waited, oblivious to the skyward struggle that had just ended. Television crews, emergency responders, and city authorities soon learned the story. Flight 715, hijacked, taken over by terrorists. Passengers bound for death, but somehow survived. Elaine's name became synonymous with heroism overnight. News outlets scrambled to capture every detail. The footage was shocking. Bruised, bloodied passengers helping one another. The restrained terrorists, overpowered not by trained security forces, but by civilians. One woman, calm in the chaos, orchestrating survival. Interviews followed, but Elaine gave few words. She deflected praise, speaking instead about teamwork, about courage in ordinary people, about the resilience of those who refused to succumb to fear. "I was just doing what had to be done," she said simply. Everyone contributed. We all saved each other. Social media exploded. Videos, photos, and eyewitness accounts went viral. People around the world were stunned. A civilian-led uprising mid-flight had prevented what could have been an unimaginable tragedy. Discussions about heroism, courage, and the capacity of ordinary people to do extraordinary things dominated news cycles. Elaine stayed mostly out of the spotlight, quietly attending to the injured, offering comfort and direction to frightened passengers. But the world noticed her presence, the calm force who had held chaos at bay, the woman who had turned fear into resistance. Inside the terminal, paramedics wheeled stretchers, and officers questioned the restrained terrorists. Elaine observed, calm but alert, her mind already cataloging details for the authorities. She knew the investigation would follow, but first, they needed to ensure safety and care for those affected. The teenage boy approached her, hesitant. I don't know if I can ever forget this." Elaine placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll carry it with you, but that doesn't mean it defines you. Remember what you did today, how you protected others. That is your strength." Passengers began to emerge from the plane, faces streaked with tears, relief, and awe. They moved carefully, some still clutching hands of strangers, some whispering prayers of thanks. Elaine guided them, ensuring the most vulnerable were attended to first. Captain Miller walked beside her, his expression softening. "I've flown for decades," he said quietly. "I've faced storms, engine failures, emergencies, but nothing like this, nothing like you." Elaine gave a small nod, her gaze forward. "We all did it. That's what matters." The world outside continued. To watch, news helicopters circled, reporters jostled for space, and authorities prepared statements. But inside, Flight 715's passengers, battered but alive, emerged into the light heroes in their own right, guided by one extraordinary woman who refused to bow to fear. In the months and years that followed, the story of Flight 715 became legend. Elaine Rivers remained quiet, never seeking recognition. Her actions, though extraordinary, were not about fame, they were about courage, about presence of mind, and about believing in the capacity of ordinary people to act when faced with unimaginable terror. And the passengers she had led that day carried the memory with them forever. A lesson in courage, a testament to human resilience, and a story of survival that inspired millions across the world. Elaine's calm in the eye of the storm, her bravery, and her meticulous leadership had done more than save lives. They had transformed the very idea of heroism, proving that in the darkest moments, humanity could rise, united, and resist even the most terrifying threats. Flight 715 had landed, but its passengers and the world would never forget the woman who had led them through the skies of fear and into the light of survival.